Welcome to the Foundation series, where we explore startup compensation with top minds in the industry. You'll hear from heads of people, from founders and VCs on how to drive results through startup compensation strategies and practices. Let's dive into today's episode. So, Jess, amazing to have you here. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural edition of the Foundation newsletter. I'm going to dive right in. You have an incredible background. You and I have obviously had the chance to get to know each other for a little while now. But for everyone that's dialing in, tell me a bit about your background, about your career, and your role at Airtree.
Yeah, well, great to be here, kicking this off. Super excited for the chat. Eh, the background story of JB. It's not really a straight one or a short story, but maybe we can just do a little whistle-stop tour of, say, the last 20 years now, which is yikes, but that to the side. I actually started off as a chemical engineer and was working in the oil and gas industry, which was super interesting. It was a lot of fun, baby engineer out in the wild. But along that journey, I had my ecological awakening, particularly working in the oil and gas industry and just kind of becoming awake to the concerns around climate change and what that meant for the future of the world. So I swung all the way to the other end of the pendulum and I did a master's in sustainability education, which I absolutely loved. It was all about the theories of social change and transformation and behavior change. And part of that was a research project and just sort of learning that process of academic inquiry and developing research questions, collecting data, analyzing that to create insights and new ways of thinking about things and understanding things to hopefully solve problems in the world, was just so fascinating to me. And yeah, I loved that approach to learning and thinking. And from there, just extending those theories into a PhD, which was a journey. I definitely love the world of academia is, it's so fascinating. There's so many intelligent, brilliant people. Loved the research side of things, working with students, but it was definitely a slower pace of change and impact than I guess what I was really looking for. And so after 7 years in that wonderful world, I was looking for something a bit more dynamic and kind of accidentally stumbled into the world of startups and tech. And yeah, I got pretty hooked, and just was enamored by the energy, the possibility, new ideas, smart people working together to solve problems. And I then went on to be able to work with a couple of edtech companies in Go One and Fathom AI and go on some amazing growth journeys there. And then now I get to have a front row seat to all of the best up and coming tech companies in Australia and New Zealand at Airtree in my role of head of people. And so I really get the best of both worlds now, being able to blend working with and enabling our amazing team here at Airtree to fulfill their potential. We've got an incredibly high performance team who are also very kind and humble, and I'm so lucky to get to work with them every day. But I also do get to support our portfolio companies as well as they're developing their people strategies, navigating, scaling people alongside scaling their businesses. So yeah, that wasn't really a short story, actually. That was more
But an
big.
incredible one. I mean, that's what a background. I mean, I think the thing that I love the most is that there's two cases there that you gave where you kind of like entered a field and then just went for the polar opposite end of the spectrum in terms of experience with oil and gas over to environmental, and then in that sort of academia into startup. And yeah, it's
Yeah,
seeing that entire
yeah,
spectrum.
huge fan of a hard pivot.
Yeah, fully very resilient person as well. Lots of change involved in those sort of things as well. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So I think one of the things that is particularly intriguing and I'd love to dive into is just you've got this experience that I think you can really speak to, which is you've had that time in startups and in businesses and seeing how compensation works from that lens. And now you've got this unique position being in VC land working with Airtree, what are some of the things that stand out to you as like a key difference when it comes down to the way they deliver their compensation practices?
Hmm. I think from a practice perspective, there's actually a lot of similarities in that in both contexts, kind of the methodologies are similar, using
Mm,
frameworks, benchmarking, salary bands, performance to inform a philosophy and decision making. So I think there's, a lot that's shared. In
mm,
terms of the differences, I would say it's more in the context that we deal with across those different environments and industries. So, in VC, for example, looking at very different industry benchmarks than, say, in startups. So, looking more to sort of finance and corporate, and then also different mechanisms around incentives. So, in VC, we use carried interest as a way for employees to benefit in the long-term success of the funds. Whereas in startups, it's more of that mechanism of employee shares, and seeing value over time in that way. And so
mm,
those different vehicles have quite different structures and mechanics that need to be viewed and understood and communicated quite differently. So I think sort of from a methodology perspective, quite similar. But
mm.
then the context and how those methods are applied is where the differences really start to play out.
Yeah. Talk about carried interest, because this is like a novel concept for me, I think, when we first caught up, and it wasn't something I was particularly familiar with. For those who are maybe interested in diving into a career in like internal people and culture within a VC, what does it mean? What's involved?
Yeah, it's definitely been a learning curve for me over the last couple of years. It is quite a unique mechanism in that, our job as VCs is to find and work with and help grow the best companies on behalf of our limited partners. So they
Mm,
invest in, say, Airtree, for example, and then our job is to represent that capital in the best way that we can, such that we could generate amazing returns for them. And then as part of that, Airtree or the VC gets a slice of the pie. And that is distributed across the team. So it's a slightly different mechanism as opposed to, say, employee equity, where you are earning shares in a company over time.
mm,
This is more a return in the distribution of those funds as they perform.
mm.
And you can also participate in multiple funds over time, which start to layer on, as opposed to in a company, that's one company that you have a shareholding in.
Such a, yeah, it's interesting. I know when we spoke about it, there's so many different constraints
Yeah,
and contexts. I know we
there's
talked
a
about
lot more
that's,
layers, and I'm
yeah.
happy to go into more detail. I think if people are interested in that, there's some great resources that, break down the way that it works, how distributions are made. I think one thing I would sort of call out is that it's a very long game.
Mm,
For the lifetime of a fund is 10 plus years. And so you've really got to think about it in the context of, investing and partnering with the businesses that you are investing in
mhm.
over a long period of time, such that you can then see those returns in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many other considerations, right? Like, what are you doing for sort of more immediate or middle term incentives as well? Like, there's such a 10 years is crazy to think about in the span of someone's career. I mean, the average within tech so often can be that sort of 2 to 4 year mark. So you're potentially seeing, two or three people coming in the lifetime of a fund. So it's an interesting thing to factor in.
Definitely.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to pivot a little bit now to the role of a head of people when it comes to startups and in particular around compensation. What do you think are some of the more critical things that a head of people needs to consider when it comes to their compensation practices and establishing them within their startup?
I honestly think that this is the hardest topic in the people portfolio because there's so many interconnected factors. You've got benchmarking, talent retention, performance, budget. It's got to fulfill so many different objectives. Is it fair? Is it competitive? How are we thinking about transparency? Is it comprehensive? Are we compliant? Does it have flexibility? All of these things need to be weighed up. And there's also an element of judgment in all of this. It's, just as much science as it is art.
Hmm.
So I think it's incredibly complex and interconnected. And so how do you start to break that down, to think about the different things that a head of people should be considering? I think as a starting point, there's some basic fundamentals for consideration, such as pay equity and fairness across all your demographics and roles, having competitive market rates, doing regular salary reviews, and then making sure you've got that legal compliance and financial sustainability. I think they're kind of the bare minimum things that, head of people or even founders in the very early days need to be thinking about from day one. But because of that complexity that I was describing, over time, it is important to layer in more maturity around some of those practices. So, and also meet employee expectations to develop a really strong employee value proposition. And so that's where layering things on, like a bit more flexibility around, considering some of those different needs that employees might have or different expectations, starting to think about how you can align a compensation structure with performance, which is often really important, particularly in a high growth environment, where people, might be wanting to see accelerated pathways and careers. And then also starting to mature those practices around more of a total reward structure. So that includes, benefits, accounting for the value of whether it's employee shares or,
Hmm.
carried interest in the VC context, to give people a sense of that more sort of comprehensive view of their compensation from a total rewards perspective, rather than just having that focus on base salary.
Hmm.
Uh, Also, I guess I would just say, like, you don't have to have it all perfect from day one, but it's definitely easier to build and iterate good compensation practice rather than try to reverse engineer it in later. So I would encourage, heads of people who might be joining a startup or founders in the early stages to think about different time horizons. What are kind of the bare minimum basic fundamentals that will set you up in a strong position, and then what are the sorts of things that you might layer in over time as you are maturing the business, maturing the practices and policies that the organization has.
Your answer just like so perfectly captures the diversity and the breadth that exists even just within compensation. And I think
Yeah.
like this is why, credit to anyone who's a head of or in a head of people or a senior like people operations or leadership role, is that like this is one of like 10 different things that they have to be across. And yet this in itself, this was absolutely the genesis for, for me wanting to do
Mm.
this, is just helping give some more clarity and unpack just exactly what's involved in compensation when it comes to startups. But it is such a detailed topic in and of itself.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, there's so many, I think part of why it's so complex is because of the way these factors are interconnected, and also then the way that you need to weigh up and evaluate them to make decisions, whether that's
Mm.
philosophically,
Yeah.
for how you're thinking about compensation principles, all the way through to the individual level when you're, trying to make compensation decisions based on performance and
Hmm.
promotion, benchmarking data. And so, yeah, I think it's a bit of a can of worms, and sometimes it can feel like you're going around in circles. So, I think, what you do with providing shortcuts and hacks and solve, like, presenting information
Mm.
of the solved problems is so helpful, because it's hard enough to execute on it. So having those resources and content and ways to short circuit how people can think about this is just so
Yeah.
incredibly helpful.
That is. Jess, you're in an incredible position where you have advantage over a number of different startups, and you get to see a bunch of their practices from a compensation standpoint, what's working well and what's maybe not, or being a bit of an obstacle. Focusing on the what's doing, what companies are doing well perspective, what are some of the things that have kind of been standouts to you in some of these startups and their comp practices?
Mm. I think the biggest challenge for startups when it comes to compensation is, they are competing with larger and more established companies that can potentially offer a lot higher compensation. And so, how can startups compete in that environment to attract and retain amazing talent despite, existing in that context? And so, I think there's a few things that startups who have been able to compete that they usually do quite well. First thing is, I think, there's a really clear articulation and compelling articulation of what their mission and vision is. So it's a really exciting prospect to be part of something. There's a mission or a vision that might align with a candidate's personal values, the growth journey that they might have the opportunity to be on. So, if prospective employees can get a real sense for what that mission and vision is and how they could, feel really excited about the meaningfulness of that and the opportunity that that presents definitely stands out. The second thing is around ESOP, so that employee share opportunity, giving employees an ownership stake in a business, and really aligning their interests with the company's success. I think that's quite unique. Not every company offers that, especially particularly in the corporate sector, obviously. And so, that's special and to be valued. It's also where the real material financial upside can occur from being part of a startup's journey. I think the other thing, startups are kind of known for is their creative perks. I think we've moved beyond the ping pong table now, fortunately, but there's definitely unique benefits that startups provide that can really reflect, a company culture and values in a way that, can really stand out to prospective employees and make current employees feel like they're part of something. Then I think one more that I would add is around performance-based comp changes. I see, people who want to work at startups often are super ambitious, really motivated. They've got an ambition to have some sort of accelerated career pathway as part of a high growth company. So where startups are able to offer comp increases that are tied to performance, whether that's individual or company metrics, I think can be really, really attractive for people. And so, maybe it's one of these things, maybe it's all of these things, but they're definitely the sorts of examples that I see creating that compelling employee value proposition that can hold its own in in a large market, and really particularly coming up against some of the offers that top talent might be receiving from, say, a corporate role, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I mean, a lot of food for thought though in terms of different ways in which to tweak a total reward package and hopefully bring the kinds of talent in that you need. What about on the flip side? What about some of the companies that you see where you go, oof, okay, here's some stumbling blocks, here's been some obstacles when it comes to their compensation practices. What are the things that you would kind of maybe caution other, heads of people or startups to look out for?
Yay, the war stories part.
Everyone in HR loves this, right?
uh I guess like the first thing that really sort of stands out is in the early stages, decisions can happen super quickly and without much process. So for example, a founder might meet an amazing candidate. Um, things move along quickly, offers get made, and then they come back to the head of people and, let them know that, someone new's joining the team on a huge title and a huge salary, and it's all really exciting and they're amazing. And then when you sort of try to mash that up with some of the frameworks or systems that might be in place, it's a bit out of alignment. So those are the sorts of things that can create friction in organizations. I think the other thing is making promises around roles, titles, salaries. I think just as a general rule, try not to promise anything to anyone, because if you are successful, then guaranteed almost everything's going to change. And so any promises that you do make, unfortunately, you'll likely have to break. And that ends up being a bad news story instead of a good news story, that, there is a new opportunity, but it doesn't align with the expectations that might have been set earlier.
Mm,
So I think that can also be a friction point. As that play, like as an organization scales, there's going to be more functions created, more levels created. How do you help people who've been there since the early stage navigate through that? These frameworks are going to be evolving over time. And so I think that change management piece is really key to help people go on that journey. And also, getting founders and your executive team to be really bought into those frameworks that as a head of people, you've probably put in place and, to just get their buy-in and understanding as to why that's important and the
mm.
future pain that it can solve, if you're able to follow through on that most of the time.
It's I'm having flashbacks as you're saying all of these things. It's like there's I have particularly fond memories of that transition when you're in a startup where you do go from an environment where managers will message you on like Slack or email or something, or just give you a call and say, "Hey, I've just promoted so and so. They're now on this, salary. Can you just make it happen?" And then that transition from that kind of culture into one where you are, bundling them together either in an annual or a semi-annual
Mm.
process, and that process particularly challenging. And I think, often because, as you were saying earlier, so much of the attraction of a startup is that fast moving
Mhm.
environment and the pace and it's dynamic and all that sort of stuff. And I think, that can be one of the challenges when you start to introduce these guardrails in the interest of fairness and
Mhm.
things like budgeting, which is crazy. But yeah, it can be a hard pill to swallow sometimes for people when you have to say, look, we're about to run an actual cycle where we'll do
Yeah.
this fairly. Can you wait 3 months?
It's a real balance because I think like that kind of system and process and structure can be
Mm,
counterintuitive to some of the magic that makes startups work. And so how do you get that balance right? And I think, part of that openness to change and having a really good practice around change management, help people go on the journey can be really helpful with that. There's always going to
mm,
be times where things will break and, people will be disappointed. But I think, having that change management mindset for both the leaders, but also, the team that you're working with can really help and go a long way to easing
yeah.
some of that.
Yeah, we've kind of talked across, the portfolio, and we've talked about, things that are being done well, maybe things that are opportunities for improvement, we'll call them. What about like trends or patterns? What are some of the things that you're seeing stand out to you in terms of the ways people are practicing compensation across various startups?
Definitely over the last couple of years have seen a lot more conversation around flexible compensation models. And then secondly, more of a total rewards approach. And so in that first trend around, what do we mean by a flexible compensation models? Definitely seen some startups experimenting with more of a choose your own adventure
Mm,
style. So employees can consider or adjust, maybe a mix of cash and equity based on their personal circumstances. As a generalization, if you're earlier in your career, you might be more willing to take a lower salary, with higher equity, such that, there's more value that you could gain over time. Another generalization, if you're later in your career and there's, family and mortgages and things like that, it could be better for the personal circumstances to choose a different composition of that
mm,
mix. And so I think that can be really attractive for people, to have that opportunity to think about what sorts of model works for them, and have a bit more flexibility. It definitely has a trade-off for the
mm,
organization in that, those flexible models are a lot harder to administer.
yeah.
It takes a bit more work to think about how you can compare different offers or mixes that people have such that you're still able to ensure fairness across roles, and levels. But I think it can definitely be something that, is super attractive, can help a company stand out, and is, certainly something I've seen people talking a lot more about. And then the second one was that total rewards approach. So definitely more of a comprehensive, view around, benefit packages,
Mhm.
including other things that have value but might not necessarily be cash. So whether that's extra leave, or additional super, learning and development allowances, programs, mental health support. Like I think there's a whole range of
Mm.
initiatives that I've definitely seen organizations start to bundle into that total rewards approach, and be able to present employees with a really comprehensive view of their compensation across a range of different factors. And, particularly in today's market of, how employees think about the value and meaning in their work, I think those things can go a long way. Like, yes, base salary, cash is always going to be important. Bills got to be paid. But I think also, have definitely seen that theme of employees looking for more than just that cash on the table, and how an organization could offer a really comprehensive benefits, and starting to bundle that into what we would call total rewards.
Interesting. I know I would certainly love to speak to someone who is on the administration side of those like flexible comp and equity models. It's such a fascinating concept. And I've seen like Netflix and Shopify and those kind of like big hallmark brands that have talked about how they do that and how they administer it. And look, it makes sense, right? They've got
Mm.
huge systems and teams and things like that. So I would be infinitely fascinated to hear from someone in a startup or a scale up who's having a similar approach. Do you think that, like, to sort of dial into that one a little bit, do you think, or what do you think are some of the considerations when it comes to that in the sense of like,
Mm.
not only administering it and how do you factor things like pay equity into it in the
Mm.
long term scheme, but then on the flip side, another, I guess, constraint I've heard of something like this model is around um, is, I guess, an access and a fairness from an access perspective, and that the kind of people who can typically dial down their cash and uplift their equity are going to be those who come from, means and maybe have the financial ability to do it. Which then potentially means if that startup does pay off, they've got more upside, by virtue of that background. What are some of the things that are coming up in conversations there out of interest?
Yeah, those are such good call outs. And look, I think with those flexible compensation models, it's the sort of thing that we've seen a lot of talk about because in theory, it sounds great. The idea of it sounds, makes sense, really appealing, great to have flexibility and options. I think the reality of it is so much more complex,
Mm,
for all of the reasons that you've just described. um, you know, I just don't see how easy it is to solve for some
mm,
of those really important factors like fairness, and equity. And
mm,
it's going to be up to every organization to evaluate for themselves what trade-offs they're willing to make. Because I think if you
mm,
do take this approach towards a flexible compensation model, there will be trade-offs. And
mm,
so what I would say to that is, go into it eyes wide open, thinking about, yes, the potential benefits, but what actually are the trade-offs going to be that you're choosing, rather than just saying, this sounds great,
yeah.
and going full steam ahead to take the time to think through what are the implications going to be. Are we willing to live with the risk that, it could murky the waters when it comes to understanding fairness across bands, making those comparisons? Are we willing
Mm,
to take the risk that, it could diminish what we're able to offer in terms of equity, for, people who are choosing different packages? So I don't think I have a really good answer or any sort of tips on how to do that. It would be more just, on a case by case basis, if
mm,
organizations are thinking about taking this approach, how can they go in eyes wide open to think about, yes, the benefits, which all make sense, but, what are the trade offs are going to be that they would make alongside that?
mm. Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think it just speaks to, that the head of people or startups should be maybe informed by these kind of marquee brands that are doing these sorts of things, but maybe not necessarily led. And that, like anything, within the people and culture space, you need to make sure that it's right for your company and kind of
Mm,
evaluate it on the basis of what you're trying to accomplish and the goals you wanna achieves an outcome. So yeah, makes sense. Like I kind of see compensation as being one of the more commercial skill sets that needs to be at the disposal of the head of people. We kind of always hear about heads of people, wanting or aspiring to have a proverbial a seat at the proverbial table. What are some key pieces of advice you would give to any head of people that would help them become more capable in wielding a compensation skill set for their organization?
Searching for some wise words. I think the first thing that really comes to mind, and this was a theme we touched on earlier, is it's so much easier to build and iterate good compensation practice rather than reverse engineer it in later. And so, starting from day one, having that as one of the core pillars of your people strategy, it can be simple to begin with, but I think if it's embedded into the DNA of your people strategy and the organization, that gives you, as a head of people, a lot more influence and ultimately, I guess, control over how it can be executed and also how it can be iterated, which is hard still, but easier than having to do these things for the first time in an already scaling organization where it's just so much harder to introduce those for the first time. I think the other thing would be, just that relationship that you have with the founders or CEO, and you know how you're advocating for people, topics, and processes, and the lens that you're bringing to that. And so, if we're thinking about how we can be more commercial, what lens are you presenting your initiatives? Is it from the
Mhm.
lens of this will really help our engagement, super important, or is it from the lens of here's the ROI for our team in terms of retention? In software companies in particular, often the cost of salaries is the biggest
Mhm.
cost on the balance sheet. And so, how can you be the custodian of that line item such that you're aware of it? You have a sense of where the levers are to control it if needed, especially in a environment right now where cash conservation is in
Mhm.
real focus. And so, how can you as a head of people present your initiatives in that context? I think they're a couple of things that can really help boost the commercial presence that you might have in a leadership team.
Yeah, I agree so much with all of those points. And I think there's so much to be said for being able to speak to what is that largest cost and just understand what makes up its components. How is it deployed? How are we, minimizing it where we can without impacting some of those commercial drivers, or how are we, or if we are looking to increase that cost, what is it in aid of? What is it in service for?
Mhm.
Are just such critical things for the head of people to be across. That was really insightful. Thank you. Um, any like final parting words, or anything, any words of advice or anything maybe we haven't covered in this that you think like, oh, we should, I would love to pass this on as a tip or something for the heads of people.
I think my parting words are the head of people role it can be a bit of a lonely one sometimes. Maybe you've got a team, maybe you don't. If you're in a very early stage organization, a lot of these topics are quite complex and interconnected, and they're subject to context. Everything that
Mm,
we've talked about could look completely different in any organization because of their organizational context, the market, the product, um, stage of company, founders, culture, values, all of these things. And so I would just say, it's so important to find your people who
mm,
you can bounce ideas off, ask for advice, find out how people are doing things in other organizations, and use that as a data source to inform and potentially triangulate some of your own decision making or initiatives or your own strategy. Because I think when you're just one person or maybe a small team in an early stage or scaling company, you can be a bit on your own. And so having
Mm.
that network to really lean on and rely on, with the work that you're doing, there's so many great people communities out there where you can find those peers and sounding boards, and really kind of build that conviction to be the
Mm.
leader in the organization that the company needs you to be.
Yes, especially for such a critical skill set. Completely agree. Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for helping us kick off this newsletter and series and everything. This was really, really insightful. So I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucky number one.
Woo! Thanks for tuning in to the Foundation series. Stay ahead in startup compensation by subscribing and joining our community of startup leaders. Until next time, I'm Matt from Foundation.